Welcome viewers. We'll discuss today Elaine Showalter's concepts, particularly the concepts that are central to her book A Literature of Their Own. Now here when we discuss the concepts of Elaine Showalter, the key concepts that she is known for are gynocriticism and the three stages in women's literary history, which include the feminine, feminist and female phases. We'll talk about these concepts and have an overview of Elaine Showalter's larger politics as well vis-a-vis these terms. What is it that she intends to do through this exercise? You will find that Elaine Showalter coined this term called gynocriticism. Now earlier than Elaine Showalter, there was Mary Ellman, a contemporary feminist, who referred to the state of criticism in society and referred to it as a kind of a phallic criticism to suggest the domain of criticism was more or less entirely dominated by men. So when she used the word of phallic criticism, what she was trying to say was that criticism is largely dominated by men and male critics. Again, in connection to this, when Elaine Showalter brings the term of gynocriticism, then you find that she is trying to focus not on men, rather on women's tradition of writing and women's tradition of critical assessment. She finds Elaine Showalter, in her essay The Female Tradition in A Literature of Their Own, finds that it has been very difficult for male critics to look at women's literature theoretically, to provide it a kind of a canon and a framework where a kind of a female pattern of writing could be assessed. Now, Elaine Showalter, along with other feminists of the 1970s, found that in each age in fact presented a kind of a special sort of a female self-awareness that came through the themes, the structure of the text and the patterns used, and there was a kind of a recurrence of these patterns in it, which in a way power passed from one generation to another. This exercise of analyzing how changes in structure, thematic concerns, patterns, images and symbols occurred in women's novels and how they probably went through a kind of a change over from one generation to another constitutes the very practice of gynocriticism. Gynocritics involve themselves in a kind of a activity where they specifically dealt with women novelists and analyzed their work specifically from a kind of a female lens, if you like it. Now, this is essential in understanding Elaine Showalter's approach. So, gynocriticism could be called a kind of a methodology that she applies in assessing women's works. In the female tradition, largely, she speaks of building a sort of a history of women's writing, building a kind of a female literary tradition, and how to access those writings, what framework to apply, whether to apply a kind of a male framework that has so far existed in society. Now, Elaine Showalter also points out how 19th century was particularly biased against women in their approach, how there was a stereotype of women that 19th century built around them, how the novel of such women were seen as novel of sentiment or observation, or seen as a kind of a self-conscious enterprise by a woman novelist. So these were, of course, male critics writing about women novelists. She also says the 20th century has been in its own way biased. For instance, the formalists of the early 20th century found it difficult to actually think intelligently about women writers. I mean, they didn't know how to work around it, and when they tried to have a kind of a criticism, a kind of an academic criticism around it, they merely went on desexing, as she says, the women text. And so they desexed also the woman while analyzing the works. So in a way, the female writer is never seen as a kind of a normal person. Either she's seen as a stereotype, or she is desexed and seen as a writer merely, but not as a female writer. And therefore she felt that there was a need of this kind of a female literary tradition which had to be built around female experience and female scholarship. Now, female scholarship of course increased in the 1960s with women's liberation movements, which in fact led to this kind of a exercise. Now, gynocriticism therefore is an approach or a methodology that Elaine Showalter coined, and there were gynocritics whose work entirely was to bring about a kind of a women's literary history and talk about its specific canon, or build a sort of a canon of women's criticism along with women's writing. In this, so as far as approach is concerned, it is gynocriticism. But then there are these three stages in women's literary history that Elaine Showalter talks about. Now, these three stages that she talks about, she obviously uses a kind of a terminology for it, and she calls it feminine, feminist, and female. But what does she really mean by that? Very simply put, feminine is the stage, according to her, in women's literature or women's writing, which is basically imitative or deals with imitation. The second phase, she says, is the stage of protest, when women become conscious of their rights and they begin to fight for the right to vote, for instance, and the suffrage movement would be a part of this, where they protested and also rejected everything that was a kind of a male enterprise. In fact, there was a lot of literature around the time in the 1890s or so, which dealt with building a kind of, that women should probably move to an island and build a kind of a women's society and reject the males and do without them in that sense. So there was a kind of a sure protest and rejection of everything and anything to do with male, and it was about gaining equality or the same kind of rights that men had, right? So this was this kind of a fiery sort of stage in women's movement or women's literary history, and this was something which got reflected through literature as well. So she's talking about feminist movements, but not really talking about feminist movements. She's talking about women's literary history in the sense how in literature or literature by women changed during this period, how literature in the feminine stage had to do more with imitating in novels what men did, how in literature in the feminist space they wrote literature of protest and built stories and plots around protest and around mass gathering, around mobilization. So it is what translated in literature. She's talking about literature primarily and secondarily about feminism as such. The third stage in women's writing or women novel writing really is the space of the female, according to Elaine Showalter, and here she says it is the stage of self-discovery. Now, what she really means here is that both the feminine and the feminist stages had at the center the male. How? In the feminine stage, women were trying to imitate men in their writings, in their novel writing or in their fictional writing, in their prose writings. In the feminist stage, they were protesting against who? Men. So men were still there. What men had, we want. What men were doing, we would like the same. We would also like the right to vote. So it always had a kind of the male presence there. The female phase, according to her, is a more evolved space where women have become more comfortable in their own skin and having gained the right to vote and having gained certain rights so it's not that she thinks that the female phase is kind of a phase which needs to be prioritized or anything, but also that these were necessary steps. Unless there was a feminist phase, perhaps there wouldn't have been the female phase for her. So the feminine phase was the natural choice of a woman who was barely trying to make sense of reality and trying to do the thing that was totally prohibited. She was entering the space of writing. She was entering the space of intellect, and which was seen as an unnatural space for her, which was a male-dominated sphere. So probably the only natural choice for her at that time was imitation. And when in the feminist phase, even though she criticizes women in the feminist phase for being too rebellious, or in the feminine phase for being too imitative, she doesn't seem to negate the fact that these become the important steps that lead to the female phase of self-discovery. It is only when women have gone through this process that they have reached a kind of a female phase, which is a phase where women turned inward, which means that they no more required a kind of a stamp to match up to men. They no more had to imitate men. They no more also had to protest and rebel, because they were quite comfortable with their own space, and therefore they had reached a level and a point at this moment in history, which was the moment of self-discovery, who they were, what they wanted, and looking inward to find more themes and more sort of a kind of more stories, rather than looking at what men looked at and how men looked at. So let me take you to how Elaine Showalter explains these phases. So she explains the first phase, which she calls, as you know, the feminine phase of imitation, right? She says, and I quote, "First, there is a prolonged phase of imitation of the prevailing modes of the dominant tradition and internalization of its standards of art and its views on social roles." So that is the first phase, which is a prolonged phase of imitation, which imitates the prevailing modes, which is obviously male dominated, prevailing modes of the dominant tradition, dominant male tradition that is, and internalization of its standards of art and its views on social roles. Now these two words here are very interesting. One is internalization of the standards of arts, and the other is the views on social roles. So when she uses the word internalization, it is not to say that women, women imitated because society wanted them to imitate, but because they had also internalized the patriarchal values, because they had also internalized the dominant traditions, and they thought that this was the actual standard of art. They thought that this was the perfect way of writing art or literature. And there were social roles that this dominant society defined, the Victorian society, and when these roles were divided or defined, then women just fit themselves in these roles, especially the female role or the feminine role of being a mother or a wife, or a kind of a pure subject, a kind of a more loyal subject, a more kind of a high moral ground that this woman took. So all these were defined by the social roles that women were supposed to play, and women were just playing along in this first phase of writing. According to Elaine Showalter, then, the second phase is the phase of protest, and this phase of protest was the phase against these standards and values, and advocate and let me just read it out. Second, there is a phase of protest against these standards and values and advocacy of minority rights and values, including a demand for autonomy. Finally, there is a phase of self-discovery, a turning inward, freed from some of the dependency of opposition, a search for identity. Now, if you look at these two phases, you will find that this second phase is the phase where they are rebelling against all the standards and values that society has already put for them. They are advocating, in the public sphere for minority rights and values, and they are demanding for autonomy. Again, suffrage is the best way you can look at this phenomena. The third phase is the phase when women are searching their own identity. They have freed themselves from this kind of a binary opposition. They have freed themselves from this kind of me and you, man and woman opposition. They are now only focused on their own self, and therefore this is the search for identity. Now, in terms of time periods, look at how Showalter defines these three phases, right? When she talks about the feminine, feminist and the female phase, then she is also historically defining them. You will find that feminism draws a lot of strength from history in that sense, that when it goes into these historical moments in time, it is able to build a narrative of its own. It is able to analyze and categorize developments and look at these developments in a dynamic form as they existed. So you will note here, when Elaine Showalter has to discuss these phases and what were the characteristics around them, then she finds it important to be able to pin them down to different stages in history, different time periods, and then because once she pins them down to that time period, then the entire culture comes alive. Then she's no more talking about a kind of feminism in the abstract. Then she's brought it down to the very historical moment of time when these things were active, when other value systems were active, when the forces of history were clashing with one another, and there the woman was trying to find her own space and her own kind of identity. Look at the next quote. Here she defines this kind of time period that I was talking about. According to her, of course, that these phases also overlap. It's not like they are defined on that date it got over. Of course, there is a lot of overlapping, but it is only to understand and to trace a kind of evolution of female history that she uses this kind of a timeline, or a chronology if you like it. She says, and I quote, you should be able to see it on your screen, "I identify the feminine phase as the period from the appearance of the male pseudonym in the 1840s to the death of George Eliot in 1880. That for her is the first phase, the feminine phase. The feminist phase as 1880 to 1920, or the winning of the vote, that is the right to vote. And the female phase as 1920 to the present, but then entering a new stage of self-awareness about 1960." End quote. So there are clearly three timelines or three time periods that she has pointed out. The first, she says, is the period of the male pseudonym. The male pseudonym in itself is quite an interesting point of inquiry if you wish to go into it. Why is it that women felt it important and necessary to take up male names for their own selves? They had to use pseudonyms. Was it this fear of censure in society? Was there hostility that they felt they would incur as a female writer, that they felt it would be easier to slip their world of imagination through with a male pseudonym? Did they feel they would be taken more seriously as a male than a female? And were they trying to fight certain biases that existed at home? Perhaps they were not allowed to write. Perhaps they could not express what they wanted to express as a female writer. And as a male writer, they could freely enter the lives of women and men and their desires and fears. So in a way, the male pseudonym, this particular phase itself tells you that there is a lot of hostility involved regarding women, that women had a tough time to write as women, and therefore they would take these kind of male pseudonyms from 1840s. Think of George Eliot, think of Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte. All of them had to use these male pseudonyms to enter into the world of literature and literary writing. And it's only when they became famous that they dropped their pseudonyms and came out in the open and claimed their authorship and claimed the fame that came with it. Of course, their works were received a lot of criticism in their own time. They were seen as blasphemous, they were seen as heretical, and so on and so forth. And this particular period, therefore, is the period of 1840s to 80s. So when Showalter refers to this period as the period of the imitative phase, right, then, or the male pseudonym phase, then it's not just these two words, but everything else that we know about this period that comes alive and comes in connection with this world. The reform bills that were active during the time, the period which is post-French Revolution period, the period where England is fighting, where all sorts of other minority groups are fighting for their rights. So women's movements gain strength from these areas and enters was this new phase where these writers themselves, such as George Eliot, she herself is writing essays on, silly lady novelists, for instance. So you see, this is a phase where everything around in the cultural sphere comes alive. When she takes us to the feminist phase from 1880 to 1920, we already know there has been a break from the earlier movement, and that we have come closest. Now women have entered the public sphere, they've entered the streets, they're on the streets and fighting for the right to votes. They have become more rebellious, ferocious, if you like, and they're adamant to win for themselves the votes and equality in the parliament. So it is that phase. And the female phase from 1920s onwards to the present. But then she also identifies a kind of a fourth phase, if you like, where women seem to be entering in the 1960s a new phase of self-awareness, which is at the same time academic, actually, because it is moving in the spheres of scholarship. Now there are scholars and PhDs in literatures who are doing this work. They are no more just simply writers or thinkers who are expressing their thoughts. They are university people who are being given grants, who are sitting in centers and writing about Victorian women or other such women. So scholarship and a kind of a disciplinary activity or interdisciplinary activity has now become academic, and various schools have opened up that have also in a way given a kind of fillip to women's movement. The feminine phase for Showalter is, is about Victorian feminine novelists who were found to be in a kind of a double bind. And what was the double bind according to Showalter? She says that they felt humiliated by the condescension of male critics, and often spoke of their desire to be taken as equals and not getting any kind of special treatment. But they were also very deeply anxious about appearing as unwomanly or as unfeminine or as male. So you see, another double bind that Showalter really talks about is that when they wrote as women, what they wanted to write, then they were seen as, then they received a lot of hostility. They received a lot of kind of a censure, because then they were giving expression to their own feelings and desires. And when they started to write like male, then they were seen as imitative. So that was also a problem and the predicament that they had to face. And part of the conflict came from the fact that they were confronting values of society that were male values, and they were actually, Showalter says that they were actually competing for rewards with men. So, and competing for rewards against the standards that had been made by men. So, of course, they were going to fail miserably against those standards that male have kept for society, and they were fighting for rewards. And when they had to fight for rewards, they had to write like men. And in writing like men, they were being imitative, because there was no scope to write like women. And those few who did, for instance, you can see streaks of the original genuine works in Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot. You can see the streaks of this kind of genuine work or genuine desire that they want to express, for which of course again they were not received, they were not welcomed in this kind of a literature groups. Again, these women, if you notice, what Showalter also tries to do is to also talk about the woman and the career that they had, the life that they had. Again, taking cue from Virginia Woolf, who had said that how did these women live? What did they do throughout the day? This was somehow missing in all history books. And so Showalter also wants to build a life, a kind of biography of these writers, because she says that unless we see them as historical beings, as real historical people, we cannot see them or evaluate them as writers. Because then if you are just talking about a cutout entity as a writer, that there is no depth in it. And if you try to patch it on to a male writer, then it is obviously a kind of an erroneous exercise, right? To see the woman writer, you have to see the woman itself, and not just one woman, but women as such, who lived in that period and the problems that they faced in that particular period. So she makes it her effort to talk about, and she raises a series of issues around this issue, where she says, how did these women live? How did they manage and juggle their homes with this kind of work? What made them work for say money, and how were they perceived? All these questions around their lives bring the writer and the critic closer to the very exercise of women writing in the 19th century. In the feminist phase, leaving the feminine phase, in the feminist phase, according to Showalter, the feminists, and I'd like to quote this here, the feminists challenged many of the restrictions on women's self-expression, denounced the gospel of self-sacrifice, attacked patriarchal religion, and constructed a theoretical model of female oppression. Now, all this is the exercise which is taken up in the second phase, which she calls the feminist phase of women's literary history, that through literature, these feminists challenged the restrictions that were put on them. They rejected the gospel of self-sacrifice, which was seen as inherent or innate in women, self-sacrifice, maternal instincts. They also attacked the idea of religion, which was deeply patriarchal, which was constantly working against their interests, and also constructing a theoretical model of female oppression. But their anger with society, with their need for self-justification, often led them away from realism into oversimplification, emotionalism, and fantasy. So this is the phase where she says there was an all-out war of the sexes in the novels of the feminists of the second phase. So they've declared it's war, it's men and women, and and she said that in this kind of a propaganda, they sort of left the realism or the literature out. You see, as I said, these stages are stages in women's literary history, how women through literature tried to depict a kind of a female tradition. So in the first phase they were being imitative, but in the second phase they oversimplified the complexity of life by calling out a war of the sexes without having this kind of by going into this abstraction and fantasy, and that was the flaw that she finds. But the female subculture, or the female phase, according to her, proves to be the best phase because it draws upon the the knowledge of the 2 centuries that had gone in passing, that is in the 19th century, and a good chunk of the 20th century. So in drawing upon the experiences of these 2 centuries, the female tradition took the best from the both and incorporated many of the strengths of these movements. In terms of language and experience, it was different. It was political. The contemporary writer in the female tradition, according to Showalter, knew that one was a part of a political system and one was political, but one also knew of the connectedness with other women writers and other women subcultures. So there was no one sort of women writing, but there were multiple women writings, and there was a sense of a kind of a homogeneity in their heterogeneity, if you like to put it that way. And the female subculture, therefore, is a dynamic entity for Showalter, even when it is a subculture. Clearly, it's not the mainstream culture, and it is hegemonized by the dominant male culture and is often seen as subservient to it. Even then, this female subculture has a lot of dynamism of its own. So, the contemporary women who come in the female phase of post 1920 or the 1960s onwards. So, here there are these contemporary women writers who, according to Showalter, have to face the new question now, how to evolve a kind of a new feminist practice and what to write in literature, whether they should devote themselves to forging a kind of a female mythologies, as she says, right, or epics. Or for that matter, should they think of a female tradition which is more based on assimilation, which talks about a kind of a seamless participation of various literary mainstream ideas and sees more of an assimilation and not a kind of division. This for her is a more evolved state of being, and even when the feminist or female stages of women's novels had to struggle with this kind of this kind of a larger male-centric cultural historical forces, even then they were constantly building a kind of a special sort of a female self-awareness, which is what these feminist critics have tried to bring to surface or try to bring to the center. This has been a kind of a central exercise of these feminist writers and critics to talk about the evolution of the female experience, to talk about the evolution of a female literary tradition. So viewers, you should have been able to gain a sense of a kind of a a knowledge of the basic concepts of the feminine, feminist and female phases that Showalter talks about. Now, of course, these phases, they come in handy when one is talking about terminology, but it in a way also charts the growth and development of the feminist movement as such, which which is done from the specific point of view of literature. Now, what Showalter has done through literature, there have been several feminists who have done it through the exercise of psychology and linguistics and several other fields. Now, Showalter's significance lies in the fact that she is able to draw a kind of a model through which one can actually build a kind of a female literary history, a female history of writing, and look at it from the specific angle of literature. With this, we come to the close of the discussion on Showalter, and I hope you found the discussion useful. Thank you.